The price of arrogance. An introduction in the glittering, high-stakes world of Seattle's elite, Alexander ruled with the cold, unshakable certainty of a self-made mogul. His skyscraper office, a fortress of glass and steel perched above the rain-slicked city, was a testament to his ambition. A place where emotions were irrelevant and deals were final. This fortress was where Eleanor stood that chilling afternoon, clinging to a secret that contained both her greatest hope and her deepest vulnerability. She was carrying his child. Alexander's response, a swift and brutal dismissal, was delivered with the same finality he used to close multi-million-dollar contracts. "It's not mine." In that moment, her future shattered. Yet, as Eleanor walked away, heartbroken and alone, she made a fierce promise. She would build a life for the child he rejected, a life fueled by sacrifice and a love that fear could not extinguish. The world of Eleanor and her daughter, Sophie, became a quiet sanctuary built on resilience. But fate, it seems, does not respect boardroom finality. 2 years later, a chance encounter, a single, fleeting glimpse of a little girl with eyes as blue and penetrating as his own, would rip through Alexander's carefully constructed world. It would force the powerful CEO to confront the truth of his cowardice and the heartbreaking realization that, in seeking to save his empire, he had lost the only thing that truly mattered: his family. The reckoning had begun. The story of Eleanor, Alexander, and Sophie. Alexander had told her the baby wasn't his, and he was gone. But 2 years later, his daughter's smile shattered his world. Eleanor had never felt so small in her life as she did that afternoon, standing in Alexander's office. The city lights of Seattle stretched out behind him like a crown of power, his tall frame outlined by the skyscraper's glass wall. He looked in every way like the damn CEO, his dark hair meticulously styled, his suit impeccable, his penetrating blue eyes reflecting both intelligence and frigidity. She had rehearsed her words over and over in her head on the way there, clutching the strap of her worn purse as if it could keep her together. Yet when the moment came, her voice trembled. She told him she was pregnant, that she was carrying his child. For a heartbeat, she hoped to see some flicker of warmth in his eyes, some sign of the man she once thought she knew. Instead, his lips curled into a sneer that sent a cold heat through her chest. "It's not mine," he said flatly, the words severing the fragile hope she carried. His voice carried the same finality he used in boardrooms when closing deals, leaving no room for negotiation. Eleanor's heart sank as she watched him, unable to comprehend how easily he could dismiss her, dismiss them. She wanted to move closer, to make him understand this was no mistake, no trick. But the way he crossed his arms, the way he avoided her eyes, told her the wall was already up, higher than she could climb. She tried to speak again, but her throat closed and her words came out broken and weak. He didn't listen. Instead, he walked to the door, opened it, and gestured for her to leave, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Eleanor walked out slowly, her heart hammered so hard she thought she might collapse. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed like a verdict. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to cry in front of his staff, who passed with curious eyes. She held her head high as she left the building, even though inside she was crumbling. The crisp evening air hit her arms as she stepped onto the street, and it felt cruel that the world could go on as if nothing had happened, while her life had just been destroyed. Every dream she had built in her heart came crashing down with his mouth and those 2 words. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and pressed a hand to her stomach. She was terrified and alone, but she wasn't entirely alone. There was a life within her, and she realized that no matter how cruelly Alexander had rejected them, she couldn't, she wouldn't, give up on her child. That little spark growing inside her gave her a reason to keep going, even if it meant walking away from the man she once thought would be her eternity. That night, sitting in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling with tears sliding down her cheeks, Eleanor made a promise to herself. She would find the strength to raise this child. She would work harder than ever. She would sacrifice everything if necessary. Alexander might have given them the blow, but she wouldn't let it define their lives. It hurt. God, it hurt more than she thought she could bear, but she wouldn't let her child grow up feeling unwanted. She whispered to her unborn baby in the quiet darkness, vowing to be both mother and father, protector and provider, however impossible it seemed. And even though fear clawed at her, a quiet determination began to take root inside her chest. A life built on determination. The weeks following that night dissolved into a blur of agony and fear. But Eleanor forced herself to keep moving, because there was no one else to lean on and no safety net to fall into. Her small apartment felt colder and lonelier than ever. Yet she tried to turn it into a place of solace, lighting candles at night and covering the peeling wallpaper with photos and reminders that she wasn't as broken as she felt. The morning sickness sometimes left her curled on the bathroom floor, but once the illness passed, she would drag herself up, wash her face, and go to work. She clung to the steady rhythm of her waitressing job. The clatter of plates and the murmur of customers gave her a distraction from the thoughts that plagued her every night. Her co-workers whispered about her growing bump, some kind and understanding, others cruel in their speculation. But she learned to tune them out, focusing only on the tips she needed to earn and the meals she needed to afford. Despite the struggle, Eleanor found moments of unexpected strength. She learned to budget carefully, cutting out everything non-essential, and spent her nights researching clinics and prenatal care options she could afford. Sometimes she would walk through the park on her way home, placing her hand on her stomach, as if the baby inside could hear her promises, whispered into the night air. She spoke to her child about the stars, about the dreams she once had, and about the future they would build together. The more she spoke out loud to the small life growing inside her, the more she began to believe she could keep those promises. It wasn't easy. Her body ached, her savings dwindled, and loneliness threatened to consume her. But she kept going, reminding herself daily that her child deserved love and stability, no matter how hard the road was. As her belly swelled, so did her resolve. By the second trimester, her baby's movements filled her with a strange mix of dread and awe. Each flutter reminded her that she was no longer just surviving for herself, but for someone who depended entirely on her. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, her eyes more tired, but her determination sharper. Nights of crying into her pillow slowly turned into nights of quiet planning, mapping out what the next year would look like, how she would afford childcare, and what part-time classes she could take to secure a better job in the future. She had no family to guide her, no partner to share the burden, but she carried herself with a quiet pride that even surprised her. Still, there were moments when doubt snared her, moments when she relived Alexander's sneer in her mind and felt the sting of rejection anew. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever wondered about the child he had so cruelly dismissed. In her darkest days, she pictured running into him on the street. She imagined him looking at her rounded belly with apologies. She imagined him realizing the truth he had refused to accept. But those thoughts were dangerous, because they stirred up emotions she couldn't afford to feel. She learned to lock them away and remind herself that she and her child were enough, even without him. The birth of Sophie. When her due date finally approached, Eleanor felt equal parts terror and anticipation. She spent nights folding tiny clothes she had bought secondhand, staring at the crib she had assembled in the corner of her bedroom, and praying for the strength to do everything her child needed. She had no illusions about how hard it would be, but the thought of holding her baby in her arms gave her a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. And as she lay awake listening to the city hum outside her window, she whispered into the silence one more time, promising her child that no matter what the world had taken, she would never let it take the love she held in her heart. The day Sophie was born began not with a sense of magic, but with a fear that clawed at Eleanor's chest like a vice. She had been alone in her apartment when the first sharp wave of pain shot through her body, doubling her over and causing a glass of water to fall to the floor. For a moment, she froze, clutching her stomach, realizing with chilling clarity that the time had come. Panic seized her as she looked around the small space. No one to call, no family to lean on, no man nervously waiting to rush her to the hospital. She grabbed the small bag she had packed weeks ago with trembling hands, slipped on her worn shoes, and called a taxi with tears blurring her eyes. The driver asked no questions. Perhaps he saw the fear on her face. Perhaps he had seen this kind of desperation before. At the hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights and the sterile smell made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. Nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, their voices firm but kind, guiding her to breathe through the contractions, to focus on her body's rhythm. But the reality of being alone pressed more heavily than the weight of the pain. She looked toward the door more than once, half expecting to see Alexander burst in, his blue eyes wide with guilt and panic. But he never came. Every contraction reminded her of his absence. Every cry carried the echo of his rejection. And yet, somewhere deep down, a stronger voice began to answer, whispering that she didn't need him, that she could bring this child into the world on her own. The hours stretched into what felt like an eternity. Sweat clung to her skin, and exhaustion clouded her thoughts. But she clung to the relief of the nurse, who gripped her hand and told her she was stronger than she believed. Eleanor held on with every last bit of willpower she had, her body trembling as if to break, until finally, in the early hours of the morning, a cry filled the room. The sound was raw, sharp, and beautiful, cutting through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They placed the small face against her chest, and Eleanor felt her heart stop, and then start again, beating harder than ever. She looked down at the tiny face streaked with wisps of dark hair, the piercing blue eyes that gazed up at her with innocence and trust, and her tears flowed freely. The nurse asked if she had chosen a name, and Eleanor whispered, "Sophie." Her voice broke, as if the name had been waiting inside her all along. She pressed her lips against the baby's forehead, and something shifted inside her. All the rejection, all the pain of the last 9 months seemed to vanish in the warmth of her daughter's tiny body. She was no longer alone. She had been abandoned, yes, but now she had been given something infinitely more valuable than the man who had discarded her. She had purpose, a reason to fight, a love so fierce it scared her with its intensity. As the hours passed and the hospital room grew quieter, Eleanor studied her daughter's features, tracing the shape of her tiny nose, the curve of her lips, and the unmistakable reflection of Alexander's eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, and though it broke her heart, it also filled her with a strange sense of triumph. He had denied her. He had denied them. But here was the proof of the truth, alive and breathing in her arms. She promised Sophie that night, under the dim glow of the hospital lamp, that she would never let her feel unwanted, that she would never repeat the cruelty they had endured. Her voice was hoarse, her body exhausted, but her soul was firmer than ever. A father's realization. The first year with Sophie was a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and quiet moments that stitched themselves into Eleanor's memory like fragile threads of hope. The apartment, though small and worn, became a sanctuary, filled with the sound of tiny cries, soft lullabies, and the creak of the second-hand rocking chair she had bought. Eleanor quickly learned that motherhood was both the hardest and the most rewarding thing she had ever done. There were nights when Sophie's cries seemed endless, when Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, rocking her until her arms ached, whispering calming words through her own tears of exhaustion. Yet, in the early morning hours, when Sophie's small hand curled tightly around her finger, Eleanor felt a surge of strength that reminded her why she had to keep going. Money was tight, tighter than Eleanor thought possible. She returned to her waitressing job just weeks after giving birth, leaving Sophie in the care of a kind elderly neighbor who charged little but treated the baby as her own grandchild. Every euro Eleanor earned went toward rent, formula, and the second-hand clothes Sophie quickly outgrew. There were days Eleanor skipped meals so her daughter would never go hungry, but she hid the sacrifices behind a smile whenever she looked into Sophie's large blue eyes. The more she looked into those eyes, the harder it became to ignore the truth of her origin. They were Alexander's eyes, clear as day, a reflection of the man who had turned his back on them. Strangers sometimes commented on Sophie's striking features. How unusual it was for such a small child to have such piercing blue eyes, and Eleanor would smile politely, while a storm raged silently inside her. By the time Sophie was a toddler, her personality began to shine through. She was curious about everything, pointing at books and demanding to know what the pictures meant, tugging at Eleanor's hand to guide her to playgrounds, laughing with a joy so pure it softened Eleanor's darkest moments. Eleanor would sit on the park bench watching her daughter play, sometimes overhearing parents whisper among themselves about how much the girl resembled someone they couldn't quite place. Eleanor dreaded the day someone would connect the resemblance to Alexander. She feared the whispers that might turn into truths she wasn't ready to face. She still avoided places where she might run into him, keeping their world small and safe, even if it meant missing opportunities that might have eased their struggles. There were nights she lay awake listening to Sophie's soft breathing, wondering how different life would have been if Alexander had believed her, if he had stayed. She thought of the way his sneer had dismissed her, the finality in his tone, and it fueled her anger. Yet no matter how much she told herself she hated him, a part of her wished he would see what he had left. That desire made her feel weak, and so she buried it under layers of determination. She promised herself over and over that she didn't need him, that Sophie didn't need him, that they were stronger without him. And in many ways, they were. However, the resemblance between father and daughter grew stronger with each passing day, and Eleanor knew deep down that one day Alexander would see it too. As Sophie became more vocal, she began to ask innocent questions about fathers, questions prompted by what she saw in books or noticed in families around her. Eleanor answered carefully, explaining gently that some families looked different, that some children only had one mother, and that it was still a family full of love. Sophie seemed to accept the explanation, but Eleanor couldn't shake the fear of the day she would want more answers, when she would demand to know who her father was and why he wasn't there. The thought tormented Eleanor as she worked double shifts, as she tucked her daughter into bed, as she walked past expensive restaurants where she sometimes pictured Alexander having lunch, unaware of the life growing just a few blocks away. One rainy afternoon, as Eleanor was carrying groceries back to the apartment with Sophie clinging tightly to her hand, she caught their reflection in a shop window. She froze for a moment, struck by the undeniable truth staring back at her. The small girl with dark hair and bright blue eyes beside her looked so much like Alexander that Eleanor's heart flipped. It was no longer just her imagination. It was undeniable. She leaned down and kissed the top of Sophie's head, whispering that she was perfect, that she was loved, and that nothing in the world could change that. Inside, however, Eleanor felt the ground shifting. She could ignore the resemblance. She could deny the whispers. But she knew the day would come when their two worlds would collide again, and nothing would ever be the same. The inevitable collision, it happened on a night Eleanor would never forget, though she had planned nothing out of the ordinary. Her friend had convinced her to attend a charity event at one of Seattle's most luxurious hotels, insisting that she needed a night off from work and responsibility, that even a struggling mother deserved to feel like herself again. Eleanor was reluctant, but agreed after making arrangements for Sophie to stay with her trusted neighbor for the evening. She borrowed a simple but elegant dress from her friend, styled her dark hair carefully, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel beautiful. She had no idea that the night would mark the moment her past and present would collide in a way she could never have imagined. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, and the drone of wealthy guests exchanging hollow pleasantries. Eleanor felt out of place. Her heart pounded as she held a glass of water and walked near the edges of the crowd. She told herself she would stay for an hour and then leave, returning to her quiet life unnoticed. But as she turned to head for the refreshment table, her gaze met a familiar figure across the room, Alexander. He was surrounded by a small group of sharp-suited men, his presence as commanding as ever, his dark hair impeccable, his penetrating blue eyes surveying the room with authority. He looked almost exactly as he had years ago, perhaps a little older, perhaps more polished. But the effect he had on her was instant and devastating. Eleanor froze in place. Her stomach twisted painfully. She wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. The memories surged, his sneer, his denial, the crushing moment he told her the child wasn't his. She had spent years trying to put that night behind her, building a life without him. But here he was, larger than life, and her heart betrayed her by speeding up. For a few seconds, she thought he hadn't noticed her, but then his gaze drifted and settled directly on her. The smile on his lips wavered, and a flash of something, confusion, recognition, perhaps even shock, crossed his face. Eleanor's instinct was to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. Alexander excused himself from his group and walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Each click of his polished shoes on the floor resonated in her chest like a drumbeat. When he finally reached her, his expression was unreadable, though his eyes scanned her face as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the girl he had dismissed. Eleanor managed to whisper a polite greeting, her voice strained, her throat deep, and Alexander returned the greeting, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was a hesitation there, unusual for a man who always seemed so sure of himself. They spoke briefly, their words stiff and formal at first. He asked how she had been, and she forced a smile, replying that life had been busy, but fulfilling. She didn't mention Sophie, though the thought of her daughter burned at the back of her throat with every passing second. Alexander seemed to sense there was something unsaid. His gaze lingered on her longer than it should have, and Eleanor noticed the way his brow furrowed slightly, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. The tension was unbearable, and Eleanor excused herself, claiming she needed some air. She stepped out onto the balcony, gripping the railing and breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. But fate was not done with her that night. A photograph on her phone lit up the screen when she checked her messages. A picture of Sophie her neighbor had sent earlier, smiling with messy hair, clutching a toy in her small hand. Eleanor's breath caught as she looked at it, her heart filled with love and dread. She didn't hear Alexander step onto the balcony until he was only a few feet away. He glanced over at her phone, and for just a second, his eyes caught the image of the small girl. His jaw tightened, his expression shifted, and Eleanor quickly pulled the screen away. He asked who the child was, his voice low, controlled, but tinged with something raw underneath. Eleanor hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her silence was louder than any answer she could have given. In that moment, she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, fleeting, but powerful. He didn't press her further, not that night, but the way he looked at her as she walked away from him to leave told her that questions had been planted, questions that wouldn't remain unanswered for long. She left that hotel with her heart pounding and her mind racing, knowing that the careful life she had built, the delicate walls she had erected to protect her daughter and herself, were about to break. The unraveling. Alexander couldn't sleep the night after the charity event. His mind kept returning to the image he had glimpsed on Eleanor's phone. It wasn't just that the girl was beautiful, or that Eleanor's reaction to his question had been evasive, but the features he thought he recognized on that tiny face. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, to convince himself his imagination was playing tricks. But no matter how many times he rationalized it away, the image of those bright blue eyes and the familiar lines of the child's expression tormented him. He poured himself a drink. He sat in his pristine penthouse with the city stretching out beneath him, and realized for the first time in years that he felt out of control. He had built an empire on decisiveness, on clarity and precision, but now his thoughts were a storm of doubt and suspicion. The next day, he found himself distracted in meetings, his usual sharpness dulled by the gnawing questions. His assistants noticed, his board members noticed, but he dismissed them with curt remarks, refusing to let them glimpse the turmoil within him. When the day finally ended, instead of going home, he instructed his driver to take him to the neighborhood where he thought Eleanor lived. He didn't even know for sure if she was still there, but something compelled him to search. He sat in the car for nearly an hour, scanning the streets, until finally he saw her. She was carrying grocery bags, hair pulled back, looking tired, but still possessing the quiet dignity he remembered. And walking beside her was the girl. Alexander's breath hitched. The child was no more than 2 years old, her small hand wrapped tightly around Eleanor's. She had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and eyes so unmistakably blue that he felt as if he were looking into a mirror of his own. The resemblance wasn't imagined. It was stark, undeniable. He froze as his driver asked if he should move on, but Alexander waved him down, unable to stop staring. The girl giggled at something Eleanor said, and even her smile carried a reflection of his own. It was like being hit by a wave. The truth crashed over him with its full force. He was a father, and he had abandoned them. He didn't approach them that day. He couldn't. The shame and fear rooted him to his seat, leaving him to watch as Eleanor guided the little girl into the apartment building and disappeared from view. That night, he woke up again, the ceiling above him blurred, as guilt and regret consumed him. He thought of the words he had spoken years ago, the sneer on his lips as he denied it, the cruel dismissal that had sent her away. He had thought himself untouchable, immune to mistakes, and now that arrogance had cost him something he hadn't even allowed himself to imagine he wanted. The following days became a silent battle within him. He wanted to confront Eleanor, to demand answers. But what right did he have after what he had done? He wanted to see the girl again, hear her voice, know her name. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Instead, he began finding excuses to drive past her building, to lurk in places where he thought he might catch a glimpse of them. Each time he saw the little girl, the resemblance only grew stronger, and each time Eleanor saw him, her expression hardened into something that warned him away. She knew he was watching, and even without saying anything, her wary glances told him she wouldn't let him back into their lives easily. At night, he began writing letters he never sent, confessions on expensive letterhead that he tore up in frustration. He tried to explain himself, to put into words the fear he felt, the immaturity that drove him away, but the words always sounded empty compared to the reality of what she had endured alone. For the first time, Alexander faced the possibility that all his wealth, his power, his influence meant nothing compared to the one thing he truly wanted, a chance to know his daughter, and he had no idea how to earn it. The reckoning, meanwhile, Eleanor felt the pressure of his presence. She spotted him in the distance, sometimes in his sleek car, sometimes across the street, and it rekindled all the anger and hurt she had buried. She had fought too hard to build a life for her and Sophie, to forge a sense of peace from the wreckage of his betrayal, and the thought of letting him in terrified her. Yet she also couldn't ignore the truth. Sophie was his daughter, no matter how much she tried to shield her from that. She lay awake at night debating what was right, torn between protecting her daughter from the man who had hurt her so deeply and acknowledging that perhaps Sophie deserved to know her father. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. The unspoken truth hung between them like a storm about to break. Eleanor knew he wouldn't stay in the shadows forever, just as Alexander knew he couldn't live another day without confronting what he had lost. The inevitable reckoning was approaching, and when it came, it would either destroy them completely or open the door to something neither of them had dared to imagine. Alexander could no longer maintain his distance. Weeks of watching from afar had chipped away at his resolve, until the desire to know his daughter outweighed the fear of rejection. One afternoon, as the city sank into its twilight glow and the streets outside Eleanor's building quieted, he told his driver to stop. His palms were sweating in a way they hadn't since his early days negotiating deals. But this was no boardroom battle, and no amount of money or strategy could guarantee the outcome. He got out of the car, his heart hammered with every step toward the entrance, rehearsing words that sounded inadequate even in his mind. When Eleanor appeared, holding Sophie's tiny hand as they returned from a walk, he froze at the sight of them together. Sophie wore a small blue dress that made her eyes pop, and when she laughed at something her mother said, the sound pierced him straight through. For a fleeting moment, he thought of turning back and running, but then Sophie looked up and saw him. Her blue eyes fixed on his, and something shifted in the air. She didn't know who he was, not really, but children had a way of sensing what adults tried to ignore. Her head tilted in curiosity, and her lips curled into a faint smile before she hid shyly behind her mother's leg. That simple gesture sent a wave of emotion over Alexander so strong he nearly swayed. Eleanor noticed his presence then, her entire body tensing, her hand tightening protectively around Sophie's. The look she gave him was sharp, full of alertness and anger, but also shadowed by something he couldn't name. He raised a hand slightly, as if to show he intended no harm, and forced himself to speak. His voice came out rougher than he intended, trembling with the weight of all the words he hadn't spoken for years. "Eleanor, please," he began. His eyes darted briefly to the little girl peering at him over her mother's leg. "I know I don't deserve this, but I need to talk to you. Just a moment. Please." Eleanor hesitated, torn between slamming the door in his face and allowing him to speak. The years of pain and betrayal ached in her chest, reminding her of the night he dismissed her, the arrogance in his tone as he denied responsibility. She wanted to tell him to go back to his world of wealth and power, to leave them in peace. But when she looked down at Sophie, she knew the decision was no longer hers alone. Finally, she nodded curtly, gesturing him toward a bench outside the building. They sat down, Eleanor keeping Sophie close in her lap, while Alexander struggled to find the words. The silence stretched unbearably until he spoke again. "I was wrong," he said simply, each syllable like gravel in his throat. "All those years ago, I was terrified. I thought I would lose everything if I admitted what was real. I told myself it wasn't true because it was easier than facing what it would mean. But then I saw her, and I knew immediately. She's mine, isn't she?" His voice broke as he looked at Sophie again. "She's our daughter." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. She tried to blink away. She wanted to remain strong, to shield herself from the man who had destroyed her once. But the sincerity in his voice was unlike anything she had heard from him before. She felt her defenses falter, though her voice remained sharp. "Yes, she's yours," she whispered. "But where were you when I needed you most? Where were you when she was sick, and I stayed up all night praying she would be okay? Where were you when I couldn't pay the bills and thought I would lose everything?" Her words hit him like a punch, each one dragging him deeper into the pit of his guilt. He bowed his head, shame burning through him, and for the first time in his life, Alexander, powerful, unstoppable, revered, looked utterly broken. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I thought being a father meant giving up everything I had worked for. But the truth is, without her, without you, everything feels empty. I don't expect forgiveness, Eleanor, but I can't keep pretending I don't care. I love her, even though I've missed those years. And I love you, even though I lost the right to say that a long time ago." The words hung between them, fragile and raw. Eleanor stayed still, her heart at war with her head. She wanted to lash out, to remind him that love wasn't enough after years of abandonment. But as Sophie stirred in her lap and leaned toward Alexander with innocent curiosity, it was as if fate had answered for her. The little girl reached out a hand, her small fingers clutching his, and Alexander's breath caught as tears welled in his eyes. That simple touch was more powerful than any argument, more undeniable than any denial he had once made. Eleanor's voice softened, though it trembled. "This isn't about me. If you want to be in her life, you'll have to prove it. Not with money, not with promises, but with actions. And if you fail, Alexander, I will never forgive you." He nodded vigorously, his chest tight with a mixture of hope and terror. "I won't fail," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear." That night, as Eleanor walked Sophie inside, Alexander sat alone on the bench, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his regret and the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew Eleanor would test him every step of the way. But as he thought of his daughter's tiny hand in his, he realized he would do anything to prove himself worthy of her. A love stronger than regret. Alexander's world shifted entirely after that first fragile connection with Sophie. From that night on, he set out to prove that his promises were not empty words, but the start of something lasting. It wasn't a simple path, for Eleanor, hardened by years of struggle and disappointment, refused to let him into their lives without showing consistency. She allowed him small, carefully supervised visits, and each one was like a test of whether he truly understood what it meant to be a father. Alexander accepted every condition without complaint. He arrived early, never late. He didn't bring grand gifts to impress, only small tokens, like children's books or crayons that delighted Sophie. For a man who once measured worth in stocks and contracts, it was humbling to realize how a child's laughter over a coloring book could feel like the greatest victory of his life. In the beginning, Sophie was shy with him. She watched him curiously from across the room, clinging tightly to Eleanor's arm, as if measuring whether this new presence could be trusted. Alexander didn't pressure her. He simply remained near. He spoke softly and showed her with actions that he was safe. Weeks passed before she climbed onto his lap of her own accord, clutching her favorite teddy bear. But when she did, Alexander felt his chest ache with an emotion he had almost forgotten existed. He read to her that day, stumbling a little over the voices he tried to invent for the characters, but her giggles of delight told him he was finally breaking through. Eleanor, standing in the doorway, watched the scene with mixed emotions. She wanted to keep her walls up, but the sound of her daughter's laughter with her father stirred something deep inside her that she couldn't silence. The transformation in Alexander extended far beyond the small apartment where Eleanor and Sophie lived. For years he had run his company with ruthless precision, but now he found himself delegating more, choosing to attend Sophie's preschool recital instead of another board meeting. At first, his colleagues were stunned, unable to reconcile the man who once lived only for his empire with this version, who canceled a dinner with a client because he promised a bedtime story. But Alexander didn't care about their whispers, because for the first time in his life, he felt he was living for something real. The empire he once thought he would lose by choosing family suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the warmth of a child cuddling into his arms at night. There were setbacks, moments when Eleanor's distrust resurfaced, sharp words that reminded him that a few good weeks didn't erase years of absence. She watched him closely, as if waiting for him to fail, and Alexander accepted it without anger, because he knew she had every right to doubt. Instead of arguing, he redoubled his efforts, showing up consistently, respecting her boundaries, and letting time prove his intentions. Little by little, Eleanor's icy exterior began to crack. She found herself noticing the way Alexander looked at Sophie, not just with guilt, but with genuine adoration and wonder. She remembered the man who used to be arrogant and cold, and marveled at the change. She couldn't deny that he was different now, and even though forgiveness wasn't yet complete, the possibility began to take root. The turning point came one stormy night when Sophie fell ill with a high fever. Panic seized Eleanor as she rushed around the apartment, trying to soothe her daughter, and without hesitation, she called Alexander. Within minutes, he was there, huddled by the bed, his face smudged with rain, his expression bright with worry. He stayed the whole night, holding cool compresses to Sophie's forehead, whispering words of comfort, refusing to leave even when Eleanor urged him to rest. When morning came and Sophie's fever broke, Alexander wept in silence, overwhelmed with relief. Eleanor watched him then, truly watched him, and realized he was no longer the man who had abandoned them years ago. Something inside her softened irrevocably at the sight. In the months that followed, their dynamic began to change. Eleanor allowed him to take Sophie on weekends, and those short visits turned into longer ones. The three of them began to share small family moments, picnics in the park, dinners in cozy restaurants, even quiet evenings at home watching movies. It was awkward at first, a patchwork family learning to find their rhythm, but in time, those moments knitted together into something whole. Alexander found himself laughing more than he had in years. The weight of his old loneliness lifted as he embraced this new life. For Eleanor, it was a slow healing, a cautious trust, rebuilding piece by piece. But she couldn't deny the joy of watching Sophie thrive with the father she had always deserved. 2 years after that first fragile meeting, Alexander planned something he never thought he would have the courage to do again. In the same restaurant where fate had brought his daughter into his life, he arranged a quiet dinner. Eleanor arrived with Sophie, unaware of his intentions, and as the evening unfolded, Xander stood up from his seat. His hands trembled, but his voice was firm. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes full of humility and love, and spoke words that carried the weight of his transformation. "I once told you I would lose everything if I chose you. I was wrong. With you and Sophie, I have gained everything I didn't know I was missing. I don't just want to be a part of your life anymore. I want to be a part of yours, if you'll let me. Will you give us another chance, together as a family?" Eleanor's breath caught. Her heart pounded as the memories of their past struggled with the undeniable truth of the present. She looked at the man in front of her, not the cold millionaire who had once rejected her, but a father who had fought to reclaim his place, and a partner who had finally learned the value of love. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Sophie, who was smiling up at her parents with innocent hope, and in that moment, Eleanor knew her answer. She didn't have to say it. A smile broke through her tears, and Alexander's heart soared with a joy he once thought was lost forever. Their story hadn't erased the past, but it had transformed it. From pain came growth, from abandonment came redemption, and from regret came a love stronger than either of them had ever known. Alexander once feared that family would cost him everything, but now, as he embraced Eleanor and Sophie in the restaurant where his life had changed, he realized he had found the only treasure that mattered. Cảm ơn bạn. Để câu chuyện thêm phần sâu sắc và cuốn hút, tôi sẽ viết một cái kết mở. Open ending. Cái kết này sẽ giữ lại sự hồi hộp, tập trung vào hành trình tái thiết lập niềm tin của Eleanor và Alexander, thay vì một lời cầu hôn lãng mạn dứt khoát. Đây là phần kết mở cho câu chuyện của Eleanor, Alexander và Sophie. An unfinished story. Alexander's voice, raw with the years of regret, and the hard-won humility of the past 2 years, hung in the air of the elegant Seattle restaurant. He hadn't pulled out a diamond ring, only the earnest, pleading hope in his eyes. "Will you give us another chance, together as a family?" Eleanor looked at him, then down at Sophie, who sat between them, happily drawing on a napkin, oblivious to the momentous decision being made. Sophie was the beautiful, undeniable proof of a past mistake and a future possibility. Eleanor's heart was no longer fractured. Alexander's sustained efforts, his consistent presence, and the genuine adoration he showed their daughter had slowly, painfully, knitted the pieces back together. She saw the transformed man, the one who chose a crayon drawing over a closing dinner, the father who wept over a broken fever. But forgiveness and the rebuilding of a life were two different things. A promise made under pressure in a fancy restaurant could easily shatter again. She knew Alexander was ready to commit, but was she ready to trust her heart with the very man who had once crushed it so easily? She reached out, not to his hand, but to Sophie's. "We are already a family, Alexander," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady. "You have earned your place in Sophie's life, and you know there's nothing I want more than for you to be her father, and a steady presence in mine." She paused, taking in the mixture of relief and fear on his face. This wasn't the clear, simple yes he wanted, but it wasn't the final no he feared. "But the man who hurt me doesn't just need to be forgiven. He needs to be forgotten in the man you've become," she continued, her eyes holding his. "I can't promise a future defined by a single night's decision. We've come too far to rush this. We will build a future, piece by piece, day by day. No grand gestures, no expectations, just continued honesty and trust. Can you live with an unfinished story, Alexander?" Alexander understood the weight of her words. He had always dealt in certainty, but she was asking him to accept the messy, uncertain beauty of growth. He nodded, a slow, solemn nod that signaled acceptance. "I can live with an unfinished story, Eleanor," he whispered, "as long as I get to write the next chapter with you both." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, strong smile that reached her eyes. The three of them sat there, the mogul, the survivor, and the little girl with his eyes, a family held together not by a ring or a contract, but by the fragile, daily effort of love. The final chapter was not yet written, and the ending remained entirely their own.